Good morning. We would like to welcome our speaker, Derek Neese. Derek, thank you for joining.
Thank you, David.
So Derek has over 20 years of experience supporting every facet of facility and technology design, strategy, and implementation. Derek has led the data center strategy and consulting projects for several years through the US, Latin America, and all over the world. He brings a broad range of business experience, including IT and finance and data center operations to clients across higher education, manufacturing, government, and financial verticals. Derek received his undergraduate degree in economics from Occidental College and his MBA from the University of Washington. He is also an AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner. So Derek, welcome. What brings you here? Tell us a little bit of what you're doing now.
Well, today I'd like to kind of talk about how our data center strategy service has evolved from previously helping enterprise clients try to find enough of the right type of data center space and power for their IT equipment loads and matching that to their tolerance for risk and tolerance for downtime. However, with the growth of the cloud and consolidation, the problem has changed. And so now we have the situation of our same type of clients with excess data center space, aging data centers, and not sure what to do with these assets that are very expensive and chew up a lot of money and capital, but are usually pretty lightly used these days.
So I get that question a lot. And I'm glad that you brought that topic, because one of the questions that I'm getting is, and I remember back in the old days, we're talking about around 2006, 2008, a lot of these data centers, enterprise data centers, that was probably the boom of the data center from an enterprise level. The financials were building these tier 4 facilities or tier 3, running around over 150,000 square feet of base floor. And I see that some of them want to keep that traditional model, but some of them are considering different options. And some of them, they as you said, data centers are aging, but they have a lot of capacity. A lot of the new technologies came, virtualization, for instance, so that reduce the space capacity. Is it reducing also the electrical and mechanical capacity as well?
Yes, it is reducing greatly the IT loads that are housed in these same assets, and that's why we're seeing frequently enterprise clients that are running at 20-25% of capacity of their sites.
So not only space, 25% of not only space capacity, but also electrical and mechanical.
Yes, yes.
Wow.
A lot of times they're using more space just because it's spread out all over the data center floor, but using very little power.
So when they have that issue and they contact you and say, Derek, what can we do? How do you start? What's the first thing that you do?
Well, the first thing that we like to do is to really get a handle on their best estimate of what they need. And that really starts with the IT equipment of current inventories to get a real handle on what those devices are drawing with respect to power, and also try to quantify any moves, changes, replatforming, growth, movement to the cloud, other consolidation efforts to try to project those loads going forward. Because the idea is, in order to determine how to meet the need, you need to know exactly what the need is as far as you can see. But it's not only just quantifying those IT loads, it's also understanding what are the latency issues that may limit where these loads can be placed, what are resiliency requirements. Sometimes there's political or non-technical requirements. So we really try to get our arms around that entire picture of both technical and non-technical requirements.
That must be a complex workload that needs to be done in real time also. So after that, what are the options? I mean, what do you do? I understand that you start looking for the most efficient use of that data center.
Well, if we're looking at a data center and we determine through this effort that it's not going to be needed, or it's going to need a much smaller portion of the installed infrastructure than for which it was built, then we'll start to look at alternative uses for that particular site. And that may include things like chopping up segments of the data center, converting it to office space, releasing it, reusing it internally, perhaps sale leaseback, selling to a colocation provider and then leasing back part of it. There's really many different possibilities associated with repurposing these assets. And that's where some of the complexity comes, because for each one, you have to consider exactly which parts of the building are affected. You have to think about what are the construction costs? Do we have to separate the cooling of the data center from the office if it's going to be leased to a third party? What about common areas? Are they included in this? What are the lease rates for each of these particular types of clients? When can they start? What square footage do they apply? So it's a pretty complex equation to come up with a forward look at the cash flows from each potential use case.
Well, now when you're evaluating, how do you start? I mean, are there any engagement tasks involved?
Well, once we decide what is required from the IT requirements of the owning company, then we'll meet with all of their SMEs, and these SMEs will include finance people, IT people, real estate people, facilities folks, to collectively try to come up with some potential scenarios that are acceptable to all of the stakeholders and are acceptable from the long-term strategy of the company. Maybe they don't want to sell the asset. That's just not on the table. And so we have to consider all potential things. And the concept of defining the scenarios is pretty complex, because you have to understand exactly what are the parameters of each particular scenario. For example, when does the lease start? What's the lease rate? How long does it go? What are the broker fees associated with those lease rates on the procuring side and on the listing agent side? So it really a lot of different cash flows. How is it affecting all of the maintenance costs associated with the building or specific to the data center? We really try to capture all of those when we come up with the analysis, because there's a lot of primary and secondary financial effects from these types of conversions or use case changes.
So how many options we're talking about that you see?
Well, it's easy to get carried away because, as soon as you create one option, for example, you say, well, let's consider renting our data center in this building to a co-location company. And then we say, all right, well, let's rent the offices also to the co-location company, or let's sublease that to somebody else. And so before you know it, you can come up with, dozens of variations. But what our analysis is focused on is to capture the main different conceptual use cases. Obviously, every one of these can be broken into 20 different ones, or through the course of actually leasing the building or implementing one of these solutions, it may vary a little, but it's going to give you the bounds and a good picture of the long-term cash flows associated with each potential outcome.
Now so long-term, we're talking about how many years?
Well, typically we'll go 10 years, but sometimes that's not enough because, for example, if you look at data center leasing commissions, you're looking at broker fees that are based on the value of the lease over perhaps 12 and a half years. And so you're including cash flows in the first year based on something that's going to happen beyond the time horizon of the financial model.
So in general, it's 10 years.
10 years, but sometimes we'll extend it just to see, okay, we're just starting to collect rent on these spaces after 4 or 5 years. A 10-year view is not giving a good picture because you're not having enough time to recover the rent or recover the maybe conversion costs within the time horizon of the model. So we'll extend it in those cases. But obviously, once you get beyond some 10 years, unless you have like a fixed lease, it becomes somewhat speculative.
So when it comes to the scenarios of the cash flow scenario analysis that you provide, we're talking about that includes, for instance, maintenance and operations and even insurance?
Certainly, because the insurance can be affected by it, and it may just be affected by the allocation to the different square footages within the building. And so you need to understand not only what the costs are, but how they will be, or who has the incidence of those costs on them. Is it passed through to the lease? And that also is affected by what type of lease. Is it a gross all-inclusive lease cost, or is it a triple net, whereas the lessee pays for some of those big ticket items like taxes and insurance?
Now, when you provide this to the different stakeholders, the different options that you're providing, what is their reaction? I'm sure there has to be a few of those stakeholders that they don't like the idea, or they're afraid because of you're working on a live data center. You're going to have to do a lot of migrations to if you're repurposing the data center, or even if you're moving to a co-location, or temporarily if you need to do a moving. So how does that work? How do you handle that complexity?
Well, there's a couple aspects to it. One is financial. Mm-hmm. And so we'll try to quantify, and quantifying costs associated with migrations is an iffy process, but we'll try to give some placeholders for the cost to migrate. But there is also the risk factors. And so when we're evaluating some of these complex solutions, we'll try to, we'll try to come up with an objective way to evaluate complex solutions on a consistent set of criteria. And, there's always going to be some qualitative aspects to this evaluation, but at least using some sort of decision-making methodology will ensure that we collectively evaluate each scenario on the same set of criteria.
So one of the scenarios is moving to a colo, the simple one. I assume that is the simple one. Let's move, let's shut it down, for example. But it requires decommissioning for it. Can you talk about a little bit about the decommissioning a data center? Is it a complex thing? Does it cost a lot of money to choose that scenario?
Yeah, you raise a good point, because one of the key aspects of this effort in evaluating a data center or data center building is decommissioning, but also all of the associated construction or deconstruction, as it were. But decommissioning a data center is not a small operation. You've got to remove generators, you've got to remove batteries, there's all of the fluids, the cooling mediums, as well as the diesel fuel. All of those things need to be removed, and that can be very costly. Some of it is offset by salvage value, but it's not usually a cash flow positive operation. And so part of the service that we provide is not only to determine what are the engineering steps necessary for decommissioning, but also for any conversion to office space, and then doing the estimation associated with those construction efforts to build those items into the cost model associated with each potential scenario.
So the scenario of the collocation, the collocation within the existing data center scenario, is it you bring a collocation facility who's interested and you have the buy lease back option, or does the enterprise consider the option of they become a colo provider?
An enterprise client almost never wants to become a colo provider just because that's out of their wheelhouse. It's not their area of expertise. It's a whole different business unit. I will say that many data center owners sort of view the idea of sale to a colocation provider and leasing back just the space they want as the perfect pie in the sky solution. However, that's rarely viable because a lot of times these are aging assets. The scale is usually a little bit smaller than today's colocation providers want. And so the pool of interested colocation providers looking to rent a 10 to 15-year-old small data center is relatively small. In some cases, that's possible if you have a special location or special circumstance associated with the data center, but it can be hard to find.
That's interesting. So it's not only necessarily the option, the most the best financial option, not necessarily it's the right option. It depends on the external factors.
Or it's not necessarily easy to find someone who's interested. At the right price, you can find whatever you want, but that might turn it less advantageous to some other use cases. And again, it really depends on all of the conditions of that particular data center. What is the competitive landscape for colocation within that market? What's the demand? All of the sort of market planning issues that a colocation provider will consider when they're thinking about expanding their space in a particular market.
So assuming that one of the other options is putting an office space in the rest. Let's say that data center is 25% of capacity. Let's put that the rest of that space into an office space. Do you have to make a lot of mechanical changes from all the CRA units that you originally installed?
Well, that really depends on the design of any particular building. Sometimes you will have commingled office and data center cooling systems. And in such case, if you are leasing out your data center to a third party, you'll probably have to do some effort to separate it or find a way to meter it so that the costs can be divided. But it's that type of analysis that's important to support any of these considerations of different use cases so that you can understand what are going to be the engineering steps and construction required and understand the costs associated with each of those, as well as the viability.
Now, I mean, so many variables, so many modeling tools. How do you, I mean, do you have a modeling tool? How are you able to create those different modeling options?
Well, it gets pretty complex because you have a lot of different variables, different types of costs that are allocated differently based on different space, based on different scenarios in different years. But we've built some tools to help us with that so that we can quickly change the parameters of the scenario. But basically, the easiest way to think about it is instead of using a typical spreadsheet tool, it's more of a database view so that we can consider many more variables without getting buried in complex formulas that are typical with a normal Excel tool.
Now, what happened with, I've been hearing this lately, and in fact, you do have experience working on this field of the clients who said, my data center, it's aging. and have this the issue of running on 25% of capacity. What happens if they consider the public cloud as an option? I mean, is it a black and white option? Okay, we're moving to the public cloud. That's it. Why am I moving? Because everyone's moving to the public cloud, or is it more we need to do an analysis and see what's the most economically feasible option? How do they handle it? Or how do you handle that with the clients?
Well, there's a few answers to that. In some cases, we focus sort of on the facilities and what's left in the data center, that side of the equation. But more and more, our customers have looked to us to help them with that decision. You know, originally we would say, well, what is going to move to the cloud, so that we can understand what's going to remain in the data center and the requirements. And they would frequently ask us, well, you tell us, you know, we don't know, that's why you're here. And so we've invested a lot in our ability to help with that, including some partnerships with some other technology companies that allow us to do the application-centric analysis to understand what applications are ready or applicable to move to the cloud, what require replatforming, refactoring, etc. And then we map to the underlying IT gear and understand what is going to be potentially offloaded from the data center and moved into the cloud. So essentially, it's something we can help with. Sometimes there's a mandate. We recently worked with a client where they were already certain that they were going to be completely out of their data center in, I don't know, 18 months. And in other cases, it's a long, drawn out, slow process. And maybe one of our scenarios would be how to optimize the data center for a much smaller load and converge as part of it. So really, there's a broad spectrum of ways of handling this, and every company looks at it a little bit differently.
Now, that client that you mentioned, the 18 months option, did they reconsider a different option, or they were certain and they ended up moving to the public cloud?
I'm not sure exactly of the success of that at this point, but I know that that was their intention at the time of our engagement. You know, a lot of times intentions do not match the success rates, but I don't know in the case of that particular client.
But do you see that happening, that they say we're moving to the public cloud, they're certain, and suddenly they change completely when you provide a cash flow analysis or a financial analysis or a total cost of or a TCO analysis on understanding what is the real cost of moving everything to the public cloud, including the decommissioning of their existing data center?
Well, I would say there are changes in directions that occur, but usually the change in direction occurs after they start to move to the cloud. And the common mistake that many make is they consider moving to the cloud, moving their virtual machines from their own ESX hosts to the cloud, and just essentially moving the same poor architecture to the cloud. But when you're using the cloud that way, it gets very expensive because it's inefficient use of resources. And so a lot of times there's sticker shock associated with that initial move to the cloud. It makes people stop or rethink it. But we don't advocate moving to the cloud in that manner. We advocate moving to the cloud in more cloud native architectures with respect to, for example, serverless architecture, so that you're paying for the CPU time only when your code is running and not just paying for reserved or on-call instances of full virtual machines, which, as I said, is a pretty inefficient way of using the cloud.
So it's not only repurposing the facility, but it's also repurposing the IT network and cloud options. So it requires retraining the IT department as well. And it's better to assure that that decision, they understand what is the real cost, so they don't consider the option eventually when they move, oh, now we need to move back. And then it's too late.
Yeah, quantifying the costs in the cloud is very difficult because frequently you can easily quantify what it will cost to run your virtual machine in the cloud and compare that to perhaps what it costs to run in your own data center, which is not an easy thing to quantify either. But the real tricky part comes when you start re-architecting, and so you're not comparing like for like. And so you can sort of have the worst case cloud estimate based on moving your existing architecture there to get an idea of what it would be. But it's a tricky business to have a precise estimation of cloud costs based on different architectures.
So it becomes a financial analysis for everything.
It always comes down to money.
Interesting. Right. Well, Derek, I appreciate your time. Anything else you want to add?
No, except that, you know, we would love to help anybody listening out there who's facing the kind of problems that we've been discussing, and we encourage you to get in contact with us.
Derek, thank you very much. Really appreciate the information, very valuable, and we hope we see you soon again.
Thanks, David.
Take care.